Hello, everybody. It's Larry Kotlikoff here with another episode of Economics Matters, the podcast. Today, we're going to talk about political science matters with the third Friedman I've had a podcast with. This is Jeff Friedman, brother of John Friedman, who's a distinguished professor, chair of the economics department at Dartmouth. Sorry, Brown. Jeff is a professor of political science at Dartmouth. And their dad is Ben Friedman, who's a professor of economics at Harvard. And I've had Ben and John on, but I decided, gee, I might as well go for the threesome, the trilogy here. And maybe we've saved the best for last. Your dad's brilliant. He was my professor when I was in grad school. We're not that much different in age, but he's incredibly active and a deep guy, and I think we had a great discussion of his recent books and also monetary policy in general. And with John, it was a great discussion of his work with Raj Chetty at Harvard and others on affirmative action and elitism, and whether going to an elite school matters for your subsequent earnings. And he's doing fascinating work in public finance and education. And so those are two great podcasts for everybody to listen to. And I have to, Jeff, I have to just ask you to hold on for a half second because my cat wants to go outside. And
Go ahead.
Riley is like this, runs the show here. Hang on one second. So Riley's deal is that he hangs out, he likes to hang outside to look at, see if he can find some birds to snatch. And then every so often he wants to come in to see if there's some new food. And so having checked out the new food, he's a good economist cat, and has gone back out. So so Jeff is like his brother and dad, kind of a Harvard man. And so Jeff got his BA at Harvard in political science, and then correct me if any of this is wrong. Some of it's from memory, and then you got your PhD in political science from the Kennedy School of Government, and he's got a quite. I just lost my page here describing his stuff. He's not to be confused by, there was another political scientist who's passed away named Jeffrey Friedman. I guess it's quite famous because when I look you up, I see references to him. But he's the associate professor of government at Dartmouth, and his research focuses on ways in which risk and uncertainty shape high-stake decisions, particularly in the domain of national security. He teaches courses on foreign policy, civil conduct, intelligence analysis, and research methods in security studies. But the description of his work goes on. He's got a new book called, which is what we're going to talk about a lot today, Commander-in-Chief Test. And we're having a debate this evening between tomorrow night. Actually, it might be this evening if we put out the podcast tomorrow. I hope I'll have to be able to have it done. If not, it'll be next week, and people will be thinking about the debate in the context of this discussion. But he's got, how many books do you have now? 3 books?
That's my second book. The first one, Warren Chance, was on assessing probability in international affairs.
Yeah. So he's got all kinds of cool associations, and his top publications in the world of political science and government, and Journal of Conflict, U.S. Army War College, connections, I guess, or publications in that venue. And then he's a fellow, has fellowships at a whole slew of top places, including like the Advanced Study Institute in Toulouse, France. I'm sure that's a highly prestigious, the Tobin Project, the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. I think that's at the Kennedy School, the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs. So you're one of the top political scientists in the country. So you're going to be telling us who's going to win the election. But we're going to mostly want to talk about your book, Commander-in-Chief Test, which is about how much I think it's about, if I can summarize it briefly, the degree to which presidential, let's say, heft when it comes to foreign policy influences elections. So let me just quickly reference some of the quotes in the back. My buddy Rob Shapiro is a famous guy in political circles down in Washington, says it's a must read for anyone interested in American presidential leadership. The best book yet written on the relationship between public opinion and foreign policy. This is Brian Rathburn, author of Reasoning of State. Provocative and Persuasive, Joshua Kurtzer. We've got Path Breaking from James Druckmann. All these are famous people in the world of political science. So, Jeff, welcome, and tell me if I, should be filling in any extra details about your background, and then let's start off with the big question, which is who's going to win the election?
Well, thanks for having me. Yeah, I'm the book you described, which is it's basically about the relationship between foreign policy and presidential elections, how the two shape each other, was the result of the last 5 years I've spent working on that subject. It's got a bunch of polling data and survey experiments that help to get at some quantitative estimates of the degree to which foreign policy matters to voters, and then some archival work showing how presidential campaigns think about the role presidential foreign policy plays in elections, and then some data in which we look at voting behavior to test out how well those assumptions hold up. So the book offers a historical treatment of that subject going back to 1960. There's a lot of recent polling data to try to give us some sense of what's going on in the world today. And I cannot predict the outcome of this coming election with certainty, but hopefully we can give your listeners some sense of what to expect over the next few months as foreign policy and the election interact with each other.
So what's your main conclusion about in the book about, and your other work, the importance of, let's say, leadership, being maybe a tough commander-in-chief, or somebody who seems like you don't want to mess around with them on elections? Is this the most important, when everything's said and done, is this the most important criteria for a presidential candidate to convey?
So the title of the book, The Commander-in-Chief Test, gets at this question you're asking: how do voters think about whether leaders have the right stuff to be the commander-in-chief? Are they strong enough to stand up to the country's adversaries? Are they knowledgeable enough to manage the foreign affairs bureaucracy? These are what I call image-based considerations. They're assessments of candidates' personal traits. Well, I wouldn't say that's by any sense the main thing voters have on their minds when they think about presidential candidates. It appears to be the main thing they have on their minds when they think about international affairs. And the reason that's important to understand, that when voters think about foreign affairs, they're primarily evaluating leaders' personal traits, whether they're the right kind of people to run the foreign policy establishment, is that is really different from asking what voters think about foreign policy issues. And that's the main way we normally assess public opinion on foreign policy. So generally speaking, in the literature on how foreign policy shapes presidential elections, what scholars do is they ask voters for their preferences about how to handle individual issues. And they show that those preferences don't appear to shape presidential voting almost at all. So for example, voters' preferences about how to handle the Iraq War might have explained 1 to 2 percentage points of the national vote in 2004. Or when you ask voters what are the most important problems facing the country, in recent decades, only single digits have identified foreign policy issues. So that kind of research is what's created the conventional wisdom that foreign policy doesn't matter a lot to presidential politics. Mm-hmm. By extension, presidential candidates don't have to think a lot about foreign policy. Elections don't shape American foreign policies. We often think that foreign policy is disconnected from public opinion because voters' preferences don't seem to matter a lot at the ballot box. But exactly as you mentioned in your question, if we instead think about the role foreign policy plays in presidential voting as assessing presidential candidates' personal traits, it turns out that that matters quite a bit. And so part of what the book does is just to document how much that's impacted US elections over the last 60 years, and just as importantly, how hard presidential candidates have tried to scrape and claw for that vote, and how that often shapes US foreign policy, distorting it from what voters would otherwise get.
So if you go back to, well, I obviously Eisenhower had great advantage here because he was the commander-in-chief of the Western Front, the or Supreme Allied Commander. But then when you get to, let's say, Kennedy and Nixon, I mean, Nixon had a lot of, I guess, foreign policy experience, having been vice president, and Kennedy, but Kennedy sounded pretty tough, and he pushed that to a degree where I think people felt like he was tougher on foreign policy on the Soviets than Nixon. Is that your impression as well, or does that come out of the data?
Yeah, for sure it does. So I think you're right that Eisenhower is the ideal candidate to put up if you're a political party. I won World War II. He's in the Eastern Theater. He'd been the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO. This guy's fitness to serve as the country's commander-in-chief is beyond reproach. And that's part of why in 1952, when he's running for the presidency against Democrats Adlai Stevenson, he's able to make very vague claims about how he's going to handle crises. Most famously, he says he will go to Korea, presumably to do something to help end the war, but he doesn't say what. And because voters trust him so much on foreign policy, he doesn't actually have to make specific policy promises in order to convince people he'll be an effective commander-in-chief. 8 years later, things are different because when John F. Kennedy runs for president, he does not have a record to stand on. You know, he served with distinction in the Navy in World War II, but he's not known for high-level foreign policy thinking. And he's going up against Richard Nixon, who'd made his career off foreign policy and anti-communism, and Kennedy's advisors are very worried that that's going to be a problem for them. So I think quite carefully about this, and the book opens with Kennedy and has a chapter on Kennedy's campaign, and it shows that they are very explicit behind closed doors that the way they're going to win this election is not by appealing to what voters want on the merits in foreign policy. It's to be to chipping away at the image of Nixon as being a tougher anti-communist than Kennedy. One of Kennedy's advisors, Itiel de Solapool, MIT political scientist, as it turns out, writes to him explicitly, says, quote, particular postures on issues will not directly affect many voters. The primary objective for Kennedy is instead to enhance his image by demonstrating his knowledge and competence. So like behind the scenes, they're very explicit, thinking that this is all about image. It's not about substance. They're trying to find some way that Kennedy can show that he's tough and strong. The way that they do that is by recommending a military buildup to close what they claimed was a missile gap with the Soviet Union that didn't actually exist. And that's really useful because Nixon and Eisenhower had tried to keep defense spending constant throughout their 8 years in office. So Kennedy realizes that he's got this ability to portray them as being complacent because they didn't keep up with the Soviets' missile spending. He promises a major military buildup in order to close that gap. Most listeners will probably recall that in Kennedy's inaugural address, he has this beautiful line about paying any price, bearing any burden to advance U.S. national security. And what he's saying specifically in the context of that campaign is we need to raise military spending in order to keep up with the Soviets.
Now, was the spending actually declining in relative to the economy, relative to GDP, or was it just staying stable relative to GDP during Eisenhower and Nixon?
Eisenhower kept military spending constant in real terms. So it was declining as a proportion of GDP. Right. And, there were causes for concern. It turned out that the missile gap argument was not correct. And there is some question among historians about whether Kennedy knew that that was false or whether he was genuinely misled. The interesting part is that according to polls at the time, less than a quarter of voters thought the defense budget was too small. And Kennedy knew this. His campaign was aware that they were making an unpopular promise on the merits. But they saw it as crucial to establishing this notion of Kennedy as being vigorous and strong and tough. And the idea that that line about paying any price, bearing any burden, still resonates with Americans now 60 years later, is a good example of how the way Americans think about foreign policy has much less to do with issues and much more to do with the personal attributes of the people who they're voting for. And because candidates know that, they often advance policies that are not designed to give voters what they want, but instead to burnish the leader's personal images to show that they're strong and tough as commander in chief.
So Kennedy, everybody should go to the Kennedy Library, which is the presidential museum in right outside of downtown Boston. Well, it's pretty close to, it's basically in Boston, a short subway ride away from the center of Boston Common. But you can see all his press conferences and the debate with Nixon, and you see somebody who's pretty stern in his disposition. He presents himself as not making jokes, just very super serious. And I think he came across as more serious than Nixon. I mean, I'm old enough to have remembered watching those things in black and white TV. You've probably taken a look at those debates. Is that your takeaway as well, that he really kind of presented himself as a serious guy throughout on every subject, even
For
though he had
sure.
incredible
Yeah.
wit and charm, but he wasn't trying to win an election by making jokes. He was.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, the Kennedy mystique had a lot to do with competence and self-presentation, knowledgeability, command of the facts. I mean, the standard common observation about the 1960 presidential debates is that those who heard them on the radio thought Nixon won. Those who saw them on television thought Kennedy won. And part of that just had to do with, I guess, the way that Nixon's makeup wasn't designed right or something like that. And he looked as
Sweating,
though
yeah.
he was sweating. But part of it was that Kennedy was just he was excellent at managing his image. And I think that's also part of why Kennedy remains so inspiring to generations 60 years later. And I think that matters a lot. And it's something that's not captured in voters' policy preferences. And when we focus on the specifics of candidates' foreign policy platforms, we're missing this visceral connection leaders have with their voters.
Let me ask you a kind of economist type question, which is, you're in an economic seminar, somebody's going to say, well, look, during the 50s, the Soviets developed the hydrogen bomb before, I think they exploded in a hydrogen bomb before we did. They also, developed the atomic bomb. We thought we had a monopoly on it, and then we found that there was a secret agent that the Soviets had planted at Los Alamos. A guy who's a German physicist who went to escape to the UK and then was sent part of the British team. Wolf, I forget his last name, to Los Alamos, and was sending home back designs of everything to the Soviets. So we had that. We had the space race. We had Gary Powers shot down, all under Eisenhower and Nixon. So there was a sense of insecurity from the events. And so my question really is kind of like an econometrician's question, which is, how do you necessarily distinguish between those events and Nixon's relative demeanor when it comes to saying, well, the demeanor was important to the election, but the events, independent of the events. How do you control for these things separately?
Well, in terms of figuring out the impact that, let's say, Kennedy's rhetoric had on votes relative to events, that's extremely hard to do. I mean, the way that political scientists typically do that is to combine observational data. So in the book, for example, I look at the relationship between foreign policy and presidential voting since 1952. But then in order to get a clearer causal identification on these sorts of things, so the observational data can allow us to identify patterns that hold over time in different elections across contexts. So that helps to screen out some of the confounds like what was going on with the U2 episode. But then we also use survey experiments in which we ask voters to evaluate hypothetical candidates. And there we can randomize the candidates' attributes in ways that give us much clearer causal identification to what they care about. And part of what the book does is to show that either way you cut it, either looking at historical trends in the observational data from what voters say on election day since 1952, or experiments that I ran in which we get causal identification, or just ask voters open-ended questions about what they care about when they think about who's going to be a better commander-in-chief between Trump and Biden or other candidates. You always get the same patterns. It's always that voters care 2 or 3 times as much about candidates' personal traits relative to their policy positions when they think about who's going to be do a better job as commander-in-chief. So I think we can be pretty confident in that just that claim of what voters care about. Then when it comes to some question about, exactly what explains the outcome of the 1960 election relative to other things, that's very hard, partly because in elections that are as close as they were in 1960, Kennedy wins by less than half a percentage point of the popular vote. There are plausibly dozens of things that can explain that kind of margin.
Including Mayor Daley in Chicago, maybe stuffing the ballot box.
Yeah, and I actually think that, it's a lesson that's important to bring up because we were to think about, what are recent elections in which a 1 to 2 percentage point shift in the popular vote would have changed the outcome. You'd get 2020, 2016, 2004, 2000, you get 1960, 1968. So I think that another reason why I'm a little uncomfortable with the conventional wisdom that foreign policy doesn't matter a lot to presidential elections is that even if we accept that economic factors matter more than foreign policy, and even if we accept that foreign policy might swing only a few percentage points in the aggregate, in national elections that are as close as the ones we have, small shifts can be decisive. And given that candidates have such an incentive to scrape and claw for every tiny margin of the vote that could swing just a few thousand voters in the right states, that can have massive effects on their campaign strategy. And part of what the book shows is that just as Kennedy is proposing this unpopular military buildup in order to claw back a few votes from Nixon in 1960, candidates ever since have been significantly skewing their foreign policy agendas in order to try to convince voters that they are fit to be commander-in-chief. I think hopefully the book gives the reader some sense of how that's a pretty consistent pattern, particularly in skewing U.S. foreign policy in a direction that's more hawkish than what voters want.
But now we have, if you take Goldwater versus Johnson, right? I think Goldwater was viewed as like too hot on this issue, too extreme. So you can overdo it, right? You can
definitely overdo it. Yeah. So part of what the book talks about is what is this commander-in-chief test? What is it that voters want to see in a commander-in-chief? And they want a commander-in-chief who's going to be strong and tough and stand up to America's adversaries and vigorously support U.S. interests. They also want somebody who has good judgment, who won't be reckless, who won't, in particular, get the United States into unnecessary wars. Barry Goldwater is a good example of a candidate who overdid it on hawkishness, activated questions about judgment, and that's a big part of why people think he wasn't viewed as a serious commander-in-chief. There was in particular the famous Daisy ad in which a girl is picking flowers in a field and enveloped by a mushroom cloud, and then the narrator comes on and says, the stakes are too high for you to stay home. And even though it never said, Barry Goldwater will get us involved in a war with the Soviet Union, everybody knew that's what it meant because it sort of rang true. So in that case, and there are many other elections like 1964 where the more dovish candidate wins. But in 1964, Johnson is still worried about this dynamic, about whether he seems tough enough to be commander-in-chief. Goldwater is beating the heck out of him in the spring and summer about his position in Vietnam being too soft on communism. And so the records that I described in the book show pretty clearly that Johnson decides in order to beat back that criticism, he has to find some way of getting tougher on Vietnam, even though voters don't actually want to go to war there. Listeners may be aware that in August of 1964 is when Johnson goes to Congress to get open-ended authorization to wage the Vietnam War. And when he does that, he's very clear, particularly to Democratic skeptics, that this is about bolstering Johnson's image in the campaign. So, for example, Johnson, when he goes to William Fulbright, who's the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committees, he just tells him that he's doing this as a tool for the campaign. He promises that he'll come back to Congress for further authorization if he actually goes to war. He later breaks that promise, but in the meantime, Fulbright goes to his colleagues and says, quote, "You pass this thing and it gives Lyndon a tool in the campaign." So
this is
everybody
not
kind of,
yeah.
I'm sorry?
This is not the Tonkin, Gulf of Tonkin resolution. This
It
is
is. Yeah, that's exactly it. And that becomes the legal basis for war in Vietnam until it's repealed in, I think, 1972. And so it's important to recognize here is that even though Johnson is less hawkish than Goldwater in the context of the election, the demands of convincing voters that he's tough enough to be commander in chief still encourage him to go to Congress and encourage Congress to give him authorization to wage a war that Americans didn't want. And so the origin of the Vietnam War is very much rooted in this kind of image-based competition among Republicans and Democrats in 1964.
And for those who are too young to remember the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, what happened, there was some allegation, which I think is still in question, that North Vietnamese, their Navy attacked our Navy. Now, I don't think they had much of a Navy whatsoever to speak of. I don't think we lost any ships. It's not even clear that whether or not the entire thing was made up. Most people who were protesting the Vietnam War, including myself, thought the whole thing was, made up out of a whole cloth. There was just nothing there. There's no evidence of it. It's kind of like Colin Powell saying that the Iraq, that Saddam Hussein had an atomic bomb, nuclear weapon, knowing in that case that it was a lie. So he consciously went up there and lied in order to get us into this war, which was, I think, in many ways disastrous. And here again, we've got revelation that I thought the Gulf of Tonkin happened because it was made up because Johnson just wanted to attack North Vietnam in a more serious way. But now I'm learning from your work that this was really about politics, which makes it even worse.
Yeah, they had devised in book shows based on documents from the National Security Council, among other things, that early in the spring, Johnson had been talking with his aides about how Vietnam was really the only issue on which Goldwater had a critique of him that the public would accept by making him look soft on communism. And so they decided that they needed to get Congress to do something to authorize force. And they really liked this open-ended authorization to use force because it didn't commit Johnson to do anything in particular. So at least in the short run, he could make it look as though he was standing up to the North Vietnamese without actually getting American troops in harm's way. But they also realized that in order to do this, they needed debate to be curtailed, because if there was a protracted congressional debate, people would start asking Johnson what he wants to do with this authority, and he'd have to tell them. And then voters who were gun shy wouldn't like that. So they make a conscious decision to table this proposed congressional resolution until there's a crisis that will allow them to get it through Congress quickly. And the Gulf of Tonkin crisis, in which there are two episodes in which the United States Navy believes it gets fired upon, at least one of which did not happen, just gives them the opportunity to do this. So part of what I show in the book is that they had written up this playbook months earlier. And the reason they devised this playbook was in part that they wanted it as a tool in the campaign. And that's again how congressional Democrats saw it. And one of the reasons congressional Democrats approved it is they wanted to give Johnson a tool in the campaign. So and what they didn't understand is it would lead to a disaster.
Right. So foreign policy led by politics or produced by politics. Important message here. And then we have Michael Dukakis, another presidential candidate, who I think the day he went into a tank with a helmet, and this kind of, he was a diminutive figure, a small guy, with a helmet that kind of covered most of his face. It was like too big a helmet. And he's in this enormous tank and just popping his head up. The whole image was one of, this guy doesn't belong there. He's somehow weak. And that, I think, was the definitive moment when people just decided Dukakis is not George Bush the first, who had a distinguished career as a CIA director before. He was physically much taller. Just he'd been kind of standing up to the Russians in foreign policy areas for years, and I think that made a big difference.
Yeah, that's it. And one thing I didn't know about that episode before I started doing this research. So I knew about the Dukakis in the tank ad, and the fact that he looks silly with the helmet on in the tank. He's also kind of smiling in a way that just doesn't work.
Right.
So that's a great example of how way foreign policy affects presidential voting is often about images, here literal images, and not substance. What I didn't know about that is that the backstory to this ad is quite interesting, and it goes back to the politics of defense spending. So in the 1988 election, the Cold War is kind of winding down, and the parties are figuring out what that's going to mean for U.S. military capabilities. And Dukakis, unsurprisingly, supports cutting defense spending more than George H.W. Bush does. And the Bush team uses that in order to make it look like Dukakis is weak on defense. And they make this argument that Dukakis, he's never met a weapons program he doesn't want to cancel or something like that. And the origin of the tank ad was that Dukakis was attempting to clarify that he thought it was important for the United States to cut its nuclear forces, particularly given recent arms control deals with the Soviet Union and the clearly receding threat from Moscow, but that he thought the United States should continue to invest in conventional forces, which, like tanks, which could be used, were still necessary. And so what he was trying to do in this ad was to make arguably a quite sensible point about how the United States could prioritize some weapon systems over others. But nobody remembers that. And the point is just too subtle. And even though most Americans said they agreed with the substance of Dukakis's defense spending package more than Bush's, all of that pales in comparison to the consequences of this for Dukakis's image and just the fact that he looks silly. And I think that's part of why ever since almost no serious presidential candidate has proposed major cuts to the U.S. defense budget. When the Cold War literally ended, there was a brief period where Bill Clinton was out in front of what he called the bottom-up review of the Defense Department, and that went terribly for him, and it made it really difficult when he was running for re-election in 1996. And ever since, major party presidential candidates have just sort of avoided the defense budget cut thing because they realize it's political dynamite, even if voters often support that on the merits.
Even though defense spending as a share of GDP, I don't know if you can really trust these numbers. The Defense Department is pretty dicey with their figures, from what I can tell. But I think in 1950 we're probably talking about 10% of GDP, and today we might be at 3% of GDP. It's still probably more, unless the Chinese are lying about their figures, which they probably are. But some studies suggest it's like as much as the next 10 largest defense spending countries are spending together, that we're spending that much on defense, yet we're having trouble providing munitions to Ukraine. But let me take us to in the remaining it's 15 minutes here, to the current election. So you have a candidate who said he was going to be able to resolve the problem with North Korea's nuclear weapons, and went out of his way to, I guess, pander to the North Korean leader. And then we had, and sending what he said were love letters, and nothing arises from this except they expand their capacities to the point where they probably can reach Hawaii, if not California, with their weapons, their nuclear missiles. And then you have him kowtowing in a very clear way to Trump kowtowing to Putin in a summit in Moscow. And now he's saying that he can resolve the Ukraine conflict the day before, even the day before he's inaugurated, in one day. So has this bravado and kind of ridiculous these ridiculous suggestions caught up with him? Do people think he's erratic? And on the other hand, do you think Biden is coming across as somehow weak? He's had these repeated interactions with Netanyahu on Israel's policy. There's a lot of people who think the Israelis have been far too aggressive in terms of their regard for civilian casualties. A lot of other people feel that if Hamas is hiding in civilians, that's the problem lands on Hamas, and that Israel should be fully supported. Biden's tried to walk a tightrope there and set kind of red lines that seem to have been crossed at some level, maybe not completely. On Ukraine, he did eventually get support for Ukraine, but it was really due to Trump letting the Republicans vote for extra military support. In the meantime, it's enough time for the Russians to take over parts of eastern Ukraine that they didn't occupy before. So how do you view these two candidates in terms of the commander-in-chief test and this election?
Yeah, I think if we take seriously the idea that the relationship between foreign policy and presidential voting has mostly to do with candidates' personal images rather than their policy positions, and if we believe that those conversations are dominated by perceptions of which candidate seems like a strong leader who will do the best job of standing up to America's adversaries, I think that suggests that Donald Trump has a significant advantage over Biden in two senses. One is that given issues surrounding Biden's age and his public performance, and in some cases his policy choices, it's just easier for Trump to project the image of strength and assertiveness that typically resonates with voters who, when they think about their ideal commander in chief. So, for example, it's the age. Trump is almost as old as Biden. He too would be the oldest person ever elected to the presidency if he won in 2024. But his just public persona is different than Biden's. And I think that matters. And the book's research indicates that it matters quite a bit. The Biden campaign often makes an intellectually compelling point that it's hard to identify a policy that a younger person would have made differently than Biden did. They often point out that the foreign policy platform they have and their record is in most cases pretty consistent with what voters want on the merits. And I think those are good intellectual arguments. They're good reasons to be skeptical of this commander-in-chief test to which voters subject their leaders. But I just think they're not particularly relevant for the majority of voters who, when they compare candidates on international affairs, are sizing them up personally, doing that in a way that doesn't favor Joe Biden.
So what would you do? I mean, one possibility here, if you're Joe Biden playing Lyndon Johnson, you get the Israelis to attack Hezbollah, and then the Hezbollah starts sending in, shooting missiles at Tel Aviv, and then you go to war with Hezbollah alongside Israel, and now you have an active war, and maybe Iran comes in and the U.S. is at war with Iran. That's a pretty good demonstration that you're a tough guy. is that likely to happen? Is that in the cards? I mean, I think a conflict with Hezbollah between Israel and Hezbollah is just a matter of days away, is my sense. Of course, I don't have any inside information on that, but it just, you know,
Yeah.
with Hamas.
My sense of the President Biden's political incentives with respect to Israeli security, which of course is different from substance of the policy, but I mean we're explicitly setting that aside. I it seemed my interpretation of the Biden administration's handling of the Israel-Gaza crisis is that it understands the dynamics that we've been talking about. That if the Biden administration puts the more pressure that it puts on Israel, the easier it is for the Republicans to say that that Biden is backing down in defense of a traditional ally, appeasing terrorists. If Hezbollah were to be involved, that would have also raised concerns about, standing up to Iran. And so I think on policy issues, at least in public, the Biden administration has strong political incentives to avoid giving the median voter the impression that they're weak, or at least to avoid exacerbating the perceived distinction among candidates. There are a couple of other dimensions to this. At the same time, the Biden administration would benefit greatly if there were a ceasefire in Gaza, partly because it would just take the issue off the table a bit, but also reduce the impression that the world is on fire. There's just sort of general sense of crisis that research shows exacerbates Americans' demands for a strong leader. I would say another variable that is worth watching as the election goes on is the extent to which the Biden administration can raise the salience of Donald Trump's stances regarding Ukraine and Russia. As you mentioned a few moments ago, Donald Trump has taken highly unorthodox positions towards Vladimir Putin and towards Russia. And his dovishness on that is way out of step with his own party. Just for example, 61% of Trump people who identify as Trump Republicans, according to a recent poll, think that the United States should maintain or increase its commitment to NATO. Whereas Donald Trump, one of his most distinctive foreign policy positions is his skepticism of NATO and his attempt to pull away from it. So that's a place where not only is Trump out of step with the policy preferences of his own party, let alone the electorate as a whole, but he's also doing it in a way that leaves him exposed to criticisms of backing down in the face of a threat, in this case from Moscow. So that's a really bad political position for him. And you'll recall that during the GOP primary, what we had of it over the winter, NATO and Russia were one of the only places where Trump's opponents were confidently and publicly disagreeing with him on the substance of things. So I think the problem for Democrats there is that Ukraine and NATO are just kind of low salience issues right now. It's sort of the war has been going on for a while. It's sort of old news. The NATO issue is subtle. It's just so much more visceral to focus on Gaza and Israel. And I think that's a problem. But in principle, there's this looming wedge issue in the Republican Party regarding Ukraine and NATO and Russia more generally that would play very poorly for Trump on both issues and personal images. And I think one question is something like, to what extent can Democrats raise the salience of that?
So if I'm Biden, I would be thinking strongly about going to this debate tomorrow, and or maybe it's today if you folks are reviewing it, or maybe it's last week or 2 weeks ago, depending on when exactly this podcast comes out. But going to the first debate and accusing Trump of being a traitor, America's worst traitor since ever, beyond Benedict Arnold. He wants to sell out Europe to Putin, and whatever hold Putin has over him, we don't know, but it's some hold. And because nobody else kisses the feet of a dictator like this, some kinds of statements like that would really go right to the throat of, and then he's going to have a hard time responding to, I think, or maybe, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that line about selling out allies is a good one. I mean, because I think that part of what part of the way in which Republican candidates have traditionally critiqued Democrats being that they're more dovish, is that they don't do enough to stand up for American interests. And, there's plenty of ammunition that President Trump is obviously going to use here, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, pressure on Netanyahu in the current Gaza crisis. I mean, there are a lot of places where, rightly or wrongly, Biden is going to come under pressure there. And I think one way of redirecting that would be for Biden to defend his record and then expose the way that Trump has done that. Those things with respect to a traditional adversary in Russia, for which a majority of his own party is quite hostile. Additionally, it's important for the Biden team to show that the sanctions that were put on place on Russia during the Trump administration, which in some cases were significant, were largely spearheaded by Congress and not by the White House. So I think there's just I'm not a political messaging expert, but the strategic objective of lowering the salience of the wedge issue in Gaza or with Israel more generally, that is a big problem for the Democrats right now. Raising the salience of the wedge issue with respect to Russia, that's the big problem for the Trump campaign. Or stepping out of the mindset of giving political advice, if I were just to identify a variable or a lever that's likely to move the needle on how foreign policy impacts the vote this election cycle, that would be one of them. Oh, the other one that I'd bring up, just because it's different and it's not in the current news cycle, has to do with U.S. policy towards China. Almost certainly that's the most substantively significant set of choices that U.S. foreign policy officials are making right now, how to manage competition with China. On paper, the Trump and Biden administrations have been pretty close on this. And there's a lot to be said for how U.S.-China policy, for better or for worse, has been quite bipartisan by comparison to other issues over the last several administrations. But the Republicans talk about this with rhetoric that is far more hostile than Democrats. For example, Nikki Haley in the primaries talked about China leading a new global axis of evil. Ron DeSantis and Vivek Ramaswamy were talking about China as America's top enemy. And the Biden administration does not want to do that, partly because they're worried about foreclosing avenues for cooperation. And I think this is a place where there is a major delta between rhetoric and substance, and a place where you could imagine a Trump campaign putting some distance between themselves and Biden with respect to their image of standing up to Beijing. And I think that's a kind of place where, depending on how national debates play out, you could see a contrast developing on the candidate's image. And given the substantive magnitude of U.S.-China relations, that's a place in which a ratchet of rhetoric in a hawkish direction could end up interfering with U.S. policy in the future. So I would also keep an eye on that for both political and substantive reasons.
So Jeff, as we bring this to a close, let me ask you one last question. As you look at the world from your political scientist's perspective and all the studies you've read and written yourself and the whole body of work in this field, do you think that we're in the trajectory of America kind of losing its place? You think that Putin's going to ultimately win in Ukraine, that China will take over Taiwan, we will turn the other way, that Israel will perhaps not be able to defend itself over the long term, and that the U.S. will become isolationist because, if you look at the economic projections at the end of the century, you have India and China just kind of straight line projections, given even the demographics aren't so great in China, but they are in India. But you also have labor productivity growth that's much higher in those countries than in ours, or per capita GDP growth. That you end up with those two countries controlling about 45% of the world GDP. I have a paper called "The Future of Global Economic Power" with that. So, given quickly, tell us what you think is the long-term picture for geopolitics.
Yeah, it's a great question. And when I think about this, I think it's important to choose our reference point carefully when we think about trends. So if we compare where the United States stands today in terms of its global role and power position relative to the 1990s, we were coming off the Cold War and the Soviet Union collapsed and there were no plausible peer competitors. And there was bipartisan enthusiasm for extremely expansive uses of American influence abroad. Obviously, we're seeing retrenchment from that. The rise of China, political polarization over trade. I mean, there's just any number of examples of how the good old days of the 1990s are gone. But if instead we take our reference point, let's say the early Cold War or the middle Cold War, things look a lot different. So, for example, with respect to Russia, I don't know what's going to happen in Ukraine, but regardless of what happens in Ukraine, the threat Russia poses to Europe today is just so much less than it was during even the latter period of the Cold War when the Soviet Union was in decline. I mean, we've seen over the last 2 years that Russia struggles to project power more than a couple of dozen kilometers off its borders, and so the notion that they pose a threat to the industrialized core of Western Europe is hard to imagine. And even though Americans have become, they started to question, let's say, discretionary military interventions like Iraq and Afghanistan, they seem to have limited enthusiasm for spreading liberal ideals around the world like they did at the end of World War II. If you look at what voters think and what members of Congress think, support for NATO is high, actually probably higher than it was during the Cold War. We've been expanding NATO. Americans don't want to extend free trade deals, but it doesn't seem like they're clamoring to bring tariffs back to where they were in the Eisenhower administration or anything. So I think generally what we've seen in the last 10 years is a recalibration, understanding that American power is not as great as we thought it was in the 1990s, developing ideally a more disciplined sense of what America's global role should be, maybe snapping back to the traditional conceptions of American power that were developed by the Truman and Eisenhower administrations. And so I'm reasonably confident the United States can maintain that. On the economic front, that's more your area than mine, but I would just say, innovations come along all the time, and the United States' great strength has historically been its ability to harness innovations. China's economy has been slowing in terms of its economic growth. The Xi Jinping government appears to be willing to trade off economic growth in order to reestablish party control. I'm not an expert in AI, but if you told me 20 years from now, America figured out how to harness that more than Beijing did, I wouldn't be shocked. And if you told me that had significant consequences for U.S. economic dominance, I wouldn't be shocked either. So I think the economic piece of this is something that could really go in a lot of directions. But in terms of power, in terms of bipartisan consensus on U.S. foreign policy, I actually think it's more robust than people think, largely because if we look in the long run, not just comparing it to where we were at the end of the Cold War, but where we've been for the last 80 years, I think there's more continuity than change.
Okay. Well, Jeffrey Friedman, professor of political science at Dartmouth. It's a great pleasure to have you with us. No prediction for the election, but lots of food for thought, and we will be in touch. Thank you again.
Thanks, Larry. That was fun.